Thank you. Um, so as I said, my name is Bilqees and I live in the Bo-Kaap, but I did tell you that I didn't come from the Bo-Kaap. I came from Johannesburg and my husband was from Cape Town. And so and this is how I ended up here. And it was his wish to live in the Bo-Kaap. And of course, I fell in love with the community first and then with the area and the warmth of the people, and I found a new family in Cape Town when I came to live in the Bo-Kaap. What happened was as I lived here, I had no idea about Bo-Kaap before I arrived here. I had visited Cape Town as a child, but I'd never seen Bo-Kaap. It wasn't a thing to come to the Bo-Kaap to come and have a look at it. So when I came to live here, it's a very closely knit community, and there are seasons for everything. You know, there's a season for the Hajj, people going on pilgrimage. There's a season for Ramadan. So every time I experienced something, it was so different to the cultural experiences I had from where I was coming from, and a lot of it intrigued me. And so I started asking a lot of questions and engaging people on their histories, and that comes from my dad. My dad was always loved making connections with people, and he loved asking them, you know, who's your dad and where do you come from, and that. And I think I got that curiosity of people and their families and their lives and their culture and that from him. And so I would do this on a regular basis, and I was totally amazed by what was being told to me, and the different aspects of it. And so I started then asking even more, and started anything I could get my hands on, which was very limited at the time. And I'm talking about 25, 27 years ago, coming to today. And started connecting with people who knew a little bit more. And I'm very sad to say that I actually didn't ever have a direct conversation with the late Ahmed Davids, but his books they still my books to go to. And so I would attend talks, etc. And so this led me to telling other people about it. But what I also found was that I was telling Bo-Kaap people some of these things that not everybody was familiar with. And I came across 2 tour guides in the area. There were several at the time, but they were the busy ones. They were the visible ones. And started chatting to them. And then a friend of mine at some stage when my children were at primary school said to me, "You've got time on your hands. Why don't you become a guide?" You know, I was terrified. I'm not from here. What are people going to say? Why am I telling this story? What do I know? And so I was terrified. And I did the course, and it took me at least 2 years to actually find the courage to be out there. And my first step was taking a group of women group that I belonged to, of women in the area who did crafts, and they convinced me to take them on a tour. And I think that broke my fear, and that was the start of what I do today. And that's basically like a storyteller in the Bo-Kaap. So why am I talking today? I'm hoping that I'm not just going to paint a very overall picture of Bo-Kaap for you, but I think the idea, and I'm so glad, Mohammed, for Takami, as I call him, for introducing me to this group, and wonderful Chandra. She and I also can't stop talking, so I don't know what will happen if Chandra, Eleanor, and I in the same room. But I'm very, very curious about people who lived in the Bo-Kaap and who had to move from the Bo-Kaap. And I find that it's so difficult to find those people's stories. I haven't come across many people who've written their stories about that. And coincidentally, Jolene, who's on here, her dad was born in the Bo-Kaap, and we know each other via my stepson. And that was amazing, because it was one of the only connections I have of someone who lived in the Bo-Kaap and had to move for whatever reason. But there were so many families that had to move from the Bo-Kaap. And I just wonder where they are, you know, who are their families. And there are many families who consisted of someone or some more than one person in a family who was of a different religious background. So maybe you had Muslim and Christian in the same family, and we still have it in many families today. So what are the connections? And I'm glad that Muhammad is here, because he belongs to an organization that has helped people, but has focused a lot on the Muslim community of Cape Town in getting family trees done. And there have been several families, quite a few families that have, the process was started. And I know that that exists. And as I was saying the last time we met, it would be amazing for other people to have access to that, to say, hey, my grandfather or my grandmother was a Pinar, or my great-grandfather was a Japi. So where do I fit into this picture? Maybe I fit into that history that's been done, or that research that's been done already. I think that's my ultimate goal, is to try to get people curious about Bo-Kaap, and they've heard something about their family, having come from the area. So, you know, like all of you here, you have a passion to ignite this in people, and I'm hoping that I can be a little bit of that spark as well. So I'm going to head straight into Bo-Kaap, and I'm just going to share a screen so that I can. So I'm just going to talk through some pictures just to paint an overall picture, because we have limited time. I'm going to speak to the pictures, and I'm going to give a very, very broad overview of the Bo-Kaap today. But I really want to make the point at the moment that apartheid entered the South African landscape, what happened here in the Bo-Kaap. That's what I'd like to go to. So I'm going to skip a lot of the history of who lived here, and I'm not an expert, and I know a limited amount of information that I do share on all tours. But at this point, I'd like to encourage everybody to look out for a book that is actually being officially launched on Wednesday, but there've been conversations on the radio stations, etc., of it already. And it's by Patrick Tariq Mallet, and it's called The Lie of 1652. And he focuses a lot on who lived here and what was happening in their communities. So the Khoi communities of Cape Town, where did they live? What did they do? What was the lie? You know, what was the picture that was painted? So the book actually, as he would say, is a decolonized history of the land. And I think it might be of interest to many people on this group. So I'm looking forward. My book has been ordered already. I'm looking forward to reading it. But please look out for the book. It's Patrick Tariq Mallet. I'll post it. I'll type it out later on the chat. So I'm going to start from when colonization happened, and that's just to put Bo-Kaap into perspective. And we have to think about now who came here and what do they need. And so skipping through history very quickly, we had the Europeans come all the way from Europe, going to the east, and the Portuguese had set the tone already for what was to be found there. And so everybody else wanted to explore the world and grab their portion of the world as colonists. And so we had along the African coast, the west coast, we had ports, and we eventually places where enslaved people were sold from, moving to the west. So when the Dutch arrived here after the Portuguese, the Spanish, so many people had explored this part of the Cape already and had been bartering with the local people. Sometimes not bartering, sometimes they were much more vicious interactions between people. And this is what I expect that Patrick's book is going to be talking about, is that relationship between people before the Dutch even colonized the space. But once the Dutch arrived here, I'm assuming that a lot of us here have some knowledge of this background, and that's why I'm doing this overview, right? So we have the need then at this refreshment station, another name for a colony, is where they were actually just supplying vegetables, eventually water and wine. As time went by, there was a need, of course, for people to work for the Dutch, and so we had now the local people having experienced Europeans previously either not wanting to be part of this or quite happy with the lives that they were leading. But also there was animosity created between groups because they were being pushed out away from their land. We know about the thorny hedge that was eventually planted, and when people went out sometimes into other parts of the land, moving further out so that their cattle could go and feed elsewhere seasonally. When they wanted to return, often they couldn't return because this piece of land now was being extended and extended to belong to the Dutch. And so the need for, and this place became quite popular, and it was much, the business here was thriving. And so this need for laborers then took a turn where the Netherlands was asked, like, what do we do now? And they said, well, just hold it there. We will start organizing laborers for you. And these laborers then came from these areas that are highlighted on this map. So we had people come from East Africa, Madagascar, India, Sri Lanka, and then the southeastern islands of Indonesia and Malaysia. And they were brought here either directly or they were brought here indirectly. That means that they were taken to other Dutch colonies, and from there may have been then transported to this colony. So we had this a very mixed group of people arriving here, according to Ahmed Davids and Da Costa, what is his name? Yusuf Da Costa. The largest number of people who arrived first were from the Indian subcontinent. So we had this mixture of people arriving here as enslaved people, but we also had the Madakas who were like, or free blacks who were brought here to work here. So we had people come and work here because of their skills, but the majority of people were brought here as enslaved people. And so this colony started growing. Now, one can just imagine from the history of enslavement around the world, the atrocities that the enslaved people had to endure, the restrictions that they had to endure. And this place, South Africa on the Cape Colony, was always a place where it was a trial and error thing. So we try this and it doesn't work, or we see that the slaves are gathering and they are, colluding. So we need to put laws into place. And this is how it continued. More and more stricter laws, creating a very unhappy environment. Skip all of that, we come to, what was happening in the city, what was happening in Cape Town. So Cape Town started growing. It started growing from the fort, which is the castle is called here. From the fort, around it were warehouses and houses built, and even enslaved people eventually were building little houses once they were freed in the town, in the city area, as we know it today, to live in. One of the places that became popular for people to build on was the foot of Signal Hill. So this is pre-slave abolishment. We had the local officials, etc., looking for ways that they could earn extra money, but also some people looking for accommodation for their workers. Some people coming into the Cape to start a life here and looking for accommodation. And so the foot of Signal Hill, which is the Bo-Kaap area today, proved to be an area that was popular for people. So we had enslaved people come. They were held in the slave lodge, at first in the dungeons of the fort. And then as the colony started growing, we had not just Dutch East India Company slaves who were housed at the slave lodge, but also then the sale of private slaves. So we had under the slave tree people being sold, families being torn apart if they arrived as families, and also, as I was saying earlier on, little like bylaws put in place all the time. Because they found that slaves were colluding so much, they would then suddenly put a kind of a bylaw in place that said, if you were purchasing slaves, your slaves must be purchased from different parts of where they were arriving from, so that they spoke a different language, possibly they had a different cultural background, possibly different religion, possibly, and so they needed to assimilate first before they could even think about colluding against their owner. So on the slopes of Cape Town, this is a picture, it's a growing Cape Town. You can see in the background there's farmlands, and there's the Scottish Kloof homestead. That is the area of Bo-Kaap today. It grew into different sections. So this is from late 1600s, but from 1724, we have already people saying that there was a little single-story house on that Scottish Kloof homestead. And so you have this growth then in that area of houses, and a man called Jan de Waal, who was an official of the Dutch East India Company, then building little houses here called huurhuise, which he hired or rented out. And this area was broken up into different sections. So it had areas, and I'm just going to skip a couple of pictures here. This is thanks to Nuha Sukker. It's a young person who did her thesis on the Bo-Kaap area. You'll see that the area was broken up into Scottish Kloof, Stadzig, the Old Malay Quarter, and Skone Kloof. Today, all of that is Bo-Kaap. But there are parts of the extended part of Bo-Kaap, and let me just go back a little bit. Okay, bear with me. So when we look at Cape Town today, and you look to the Noongan area, and then towards the CTICC on the top of the diagram of the map here, that goes towards the docks. When we come down to the south, we come to the area to the right, District 6, and then coming right down into the Company Gardens. This area of Bo-Kaap wasn't called Bo-Kaap. Bo-Kaap was a name that people referred to. So as this area started growing, the Scottish Kloof area, which is a name that remains through apartheid, we had people living in all parts of this area. So people in District 6, for example, would refer to, if they were visiting someone up on the hill, they would say, "Hulle gaan Bo-Kaap toe." So they're going to the upper parts of Cape Town. And those upper parts of Cape Town also consisted of areas down right into the city. So when we look at the city today, all the way from Long Street, all the way up into Bo-Kaap, and then going towards the sea, going to the docks, that whole area consisted eventually of a very mixed group of people. So from that little establishment of huurhuise, and that we then go into the freedom of slaves in 1834, and it was after this that we had a lot of previously enslaved people coming to this area. Before this, we had shopkeepers, perhaps some Eastern European people, perhaps of Jewish descent. We had a mixture of people, including the Madeikas, some Madeikas who would have settled up here. We had exiles who had arrived here from the East, who were sent here to be exiled, who were educated people. They were leaders, they were imams or priests from where they came from. They posed a threat to the Dutch in the East, and so they were sent into exile here at the Cape. And some of them settled in this area. Some there's a whole history to that, which I won't go into today. But what I'm really trying to say is this area of Bo-Kaap was so much bigger than we know it today. And along now comes apartheid and the Group Areas Act. So before the Group Areas Act, we have the Population Registration Act, and we have people then, I'm just going to skip a few pictures here. We have people then being classified according to their skin color. It actually is, you know, if it wasn't so sad and so horrific, one could have a good laugh about how it happened, because the Population Registration Act actually had changed at least 6 times. People, you know, at first the way to describe colored people, for example, was someone who was not white nor native. And then they realized that someone brought up the topic and said, hey, sorry, that doesn't work. It's not just about an appearance, it's about being accepted as a person. It's about your lineage. And so the act would be changed again, and it would be changed again, it would go on. And so eventually we have subcategories of this colored category under the Group Areas, under the Population Registration Act. Then we have the Group Areas Act coming in and saying, you guys can't stay together. Of course, we're going to separate you into different areas, and everybody gets sent to islands for the Indians and Athlone for colored people. And what happens to Bo-Kaap? Bo-Kaap then gets left. It's something that many people don't realize, because a lot of people think that Bo-Kaap was possibly always very Muslim. It wasn't. Bo-Kaap was made up of a mixture of people. But when the Group Areas Act came along and the Population Registration Act, the Group Areas Act then said all people who were then called Cape Malay. So the Malay group, Cape Malay had to live in the Malay group area. The Malay group area was the smaller part of Bo-Kaap. Now the boundary is Buitengracht Street. Let me go back to that map so you have a good idea. Yeah. So we have Buitengracht Street is your is the thick main road between Bo-Kaap and the Houses of Parliament that you see there. That becomes the boundary and the buffer zone. Apartheid was full of buffer zones. The buffer zone was a zone that protected people from another lot of people. We had that in bigger township areas and how the whole apartheid landscape was designed. So you had the Buitengracht Street area, Strand Street on the one side, and then on the other side, Military Road and Witfoot Street, creating these boundaries. And then the top part of Bo-Kaap, as you look up the hill towards the Noongan, ends where the Table Mountain National Park takes over. So now we have the smaller area, but it becomes a Malay group area. And what is that? Malay group area now starts becoming defined as an area for Malay people. And the Malay people were people who are Muslim, according to apartheid, of Muslim descent. Now, this could not always be true, because you could have had a family that had many Malay cultural habits, but were not necessarily Muslim. So this word Malay is a misnomer in many ways, because it actually came about, according to most historians, it came about from a language that was spoken amongst people who arrived here. So if you imagine all of these people arriving from the East over 200 years, and they now try to communicate with each other because they're working with each other, one of the things you would have people ask each other was like, what do you speak? You know, do you speak Hindi? Do you speak Swahili? Do you speak Malayu? And so this language that the Dutch kept hearing and associating with Southeast Asians was then led them to call people who looked a certain way and came from Southeast Asia Malays. Now today, if you look around, you tell me how many people, if you were not South African and you had a lineup of different people in front of you, it's very possible you could get that wrong. That someone who is not Malay not Southeast Asian, has more of something else in their DNA, could be then referred to as someone from Southeast Asia, because those features are all mixed up. That's our beautiful South African community now. So we now, okay, so now we have this Malay group area. What happens to Mrs. Hendricks up the road, who's not a Muslim Mrs. Hendricks? She doesn't get classified as Cape Malay. What happens to her? Her sister lives next door, but her sister is Muslim. Her sister gets to live here if she passes as a Cape Malay, but she has to move out of the area. So now we have, through the Group Areas Act, people moving out of Bo-Kaap. Bo-Kaap technically becomes now the only place, correct me if I'm wrong, but to my knowledge, the only place in South Africa that now classified people under a religion, not just a subcategory of colored. So, I think I want to touch on religion, because religion was a kind of a deciding factor here when people were separated. So when you look at the Bo-Kaap and the extended, the old Bo-Kaap area, here in Bo-Kaap, we still like to refer to it as the Bo-Kaap area. What happened was that there was a plan in early 1900s already to create a bigger city space or town space. And so through different acts, the one was the Native Land Act, the Slums Act, parts of the city kept being taken away from people, often being left to disrepair deliberately so that they could take it away, break it down, and create the city landscape. You had people moving out, and early already in the 1900s, we had Black Xhosa people being moved out of Cape Town. So already based on color, at that time, pre-apartheid, we had people being moved out as a group of people. But just coming back to religion, when you look at this area now, and you look at the border that just passed the buffer zone into the city area, that's a very, very important strip in terms of talking about the history of the area. In that strip there, you have St. Stephen's Church and you have St. Paul's Church. Those two churches could not have been there if there wasn't a community around those churches to service. And I know many families who still come back to certain services or certain special services at different times of the year to their church, their old churches. We have very few Christian families left in the Bo-Kaap who were originally from the Bo-Kaap. How did they manage to stay here is something I would love someone to do research on. Two things that I know of was either someone had themselves classified as Cape Malay to be able to stay here, but continued practicing as a Christian. Another way would be to kind of remain under the radar. It's like you didn't go away, nobody caught you out, you're still here. But for most of the families moved out of the area. So we look at how many mosques are in the area, and people often get confused because of that and say, well, it was always a Muslim area. The number of mosques didn't come about necessarily because of the number of Muslims in the area. In the early days of religious freedom, so religious freedom came to all of us only in 1804. So in the early days of religious freedom, you often found people disagreeing with each other. One person knew better than the next about how the mosque needed to be run. You might have factions in the mosque and someone going off to start another mosque. And so there were at least 2 or 3 mosques in the area that were started like that because of differences between congregants. And then, of course, people wanted to build a mosque. The land was given, so we're building a mosque. There's a fascinating history to the mosques of the area, especially the first mosque. That can be a whole talk on its own. But just the point being made is that those churches are still here. The St. Paul's Church is a very active church still. And we recently, during COVID, actually lost the caretaker of the church. And so we have these few families left. So there's a very varied background to who lived here, and I'd love to encourage people to explore that. I've put on Facebook, I put out once asking people, who who had family in Bo-Kaap and moved out, and can I know a little bit more? But it's either that people didn't really want to talk about it because it was painful, and we have that with all groups, or that that I just wasn't reaching the right people. So hopefully, I'd love to see people explore that. I'm going to end there, and I'm also looking forward to hearing Mel's talk today. Thank you.